Thank you. So I feel like, as so often happens in my life, Michelle Mello totally preempted about half of what I was going to say. So some of the things I'm just going to try and maybe not repeat what she said, but expand a little bit. And so I was actually asked to talk about machine learning, deep learning neural networks, and related ethical issues. And of course, inevitably, many of those issues revolve around data sharing. And I think, so Michelle talked about that, and actually kind of the same way I was thinking about talking about that. So we have figured out some reasonable ways to govern research data sharing. So we have data sharing repositories. We have some governance around that. People have nowadays increasingly some knowledge about the fact that their data will be shared if they are explicitly a research participant or subject. But with clinical data, I think there's still a lot less certainty and a lot less development of data governance for sharing. So there are many government and federal, or there were a number of federal attempts to gather clinical data for quality analysis purposes. But in the realm of training algorithms, we need big data and lots of it, right? We need data, we need lots of data. And so we have the Alphabets and the Microsofts going around to radiology departments and saying, you know, we would like to buy 20 million images and accompanying medical data out of your PACS system, right? So that's a different kind of sharing of data that people whose medical images and medical information are attempted to be shared they didn't come into and interact with the healthcare system with the understanding that this is what was going to happen with their data. And I think Michelle was exactly right that when you're sharing into it's not just that it's a commercial space, but that it's a commercial space with a really, really different set of norms, professional commitments, economic commitments, right? So pharmaceutical companies, for better or worse, have developed with FDA oversight, with IRBs, with the understanding that they are regulated for the purpose of protecting their research participants and future users of their products. The Alphabets of the world have not developed with that same set of norms and commitments, right? So as a matter of the social sphere, the sphere of justice, the field of practice, what you're now doing is trying to transfer data from a context in which the norms, the healthcare context, where to at least some extent, the norms governing that context have to do with putting the interests of the patient at the center of our decision making. Now that, of course, is not maybe as pervasive or strong a norm as many people would want in the healthcare context. Nonetheless, it is still an important norm in that context. And you are trying to move the data now into a different, not just a commercial context, but a context where that norm of putting the patient's interests at the center really is not part of the context. And so recently, Nicholson Price and Glenn Cohen published an article in which they were talking about this kind of data sharing of clinical data for machine learning. And they, you know, at the end concluded, well, we need to basically expand the circles of trust to maybe include these other kinds of entities like the Googles and the Microsofts and so forth. I am not convinced that I am not convinced that we should or could do that without substantially transforming the nature of a Google or a Microsoft, right? To me, the core problem is that the norms that govern that particular kind of commercial space are incredibly different. And just for instance, the whole move fast and break things norm, the whole norm of we're going to deploy something and then fix it as we go along, as people are using it, that might work fine for apps that help recommend the next book for you to read or the next movie for you to watch. But that's a very different set of norms than the norms that we have applied in the medical context, where when we put out a medical device into the world or drug into the world, we have some kind of pre-market assessment of its safety and efficacy. Very different world than the world of machine learning, where those companies are expecting that they're going to be somehow accessing data that is going to allow them to improve their product once it has been deployed, right? And I sometimes, in interacting with those companies, have the feeling that they actually don't understand, right, how data are situated in a healthcare context. So, for instance, if you are developing a machine learning algorithm that is going to help interpret the results of clinical laboratory tests, right? So complex omic tests, for example, you're developing machine learning that will help interpret the results of that test. If you think that you're going to improve that algorithm after it's been deployed using real world data, you need to not only get access to the data about how the clinical lab is using that test, you also need access to outcome data. But that outcome data is not necessarily going to be in the clinical laboratory. It probably won't be. It's going to be with a healthcare provider. That outcome data might not come for a long time, right? At what point do we assess the outcome? It might be years in the future, depending on what that test was supposed to assess. So this, I think sometimes there are these easy assumptions that come out of the domain of these large data companies that really don't apply in the healthcare context. But when you're trying to move data across these contexts, people don't necessarily understand that. So that brings me to another point, which I think relates to some things that Suchi said, which is that if people are working on the data and they don't actually understand the context in which the data were generated, the likelihood that they will produce something that has various kinds of statistical or other biases, or that just doesn't work, or that has no clinical utility, the likelihood of all of those kinds of problems is going to be much greater. And sometimes there's this assumption that well, a mathematician is a mathematician is a mathematician, and a person who's really good at writing algorithms can do that for financial data, or they can do it for health data. And what we all really need to do is just give, Google or Microsoft or whoever all of our health data, and they will transform medicine. And I think we have lots of examples of the fact that you need to create a conversation between the subject matter experts and the algorithm writers in order to get reasonable outcomes, in order to be able to assess a lot of aspects of how the algorithm is operating, whether it's interpretable to future users, whether its outcomes actually make any sense, all of those kinds of things. If you do not have collaboration, if you do not have some people with the subject matter expertise informing the development of the algorithm, it's likely to be a mess and either not be useful or to do a lot of harm, I would say. So this goes to something which Sushi and I and a few people from the Machine Learning for Healthcare meeting got together. We spent about a year putting together a paper that was published in Nature Medicine. And I think that paper is part of a conversation that is only starting, including data scientists and other stakeholders, about developing standards for when we implement machine learning algorithms in a healthcare context. What does it mean to be responsible about that? So, I actually loved when Suchi said, well, we should treat algorithms the same way we should treat drugs. We should have similar standards for them. The truth is, right now, we don't, because algorithms are either not regulated, or they are regulated as medical devices. And the standards of evidence that needs to be produced for a medical device to be authorized for marketing are actually a lot lower, in my opinion, or certainly we demand less evidence in that context. And so this brings me to another point, which is just that, yes, algorithms, some of them are medical devices. In our research setting, we have this idea, and I think it's an important one, that in order to validate our algorithms and so forth, we need to be sharing code as well as data sets, and that's important. But when you share them, sometimes they are a medical device, and so they need to be shared with appropriate, research use only kinds of labeling and so forth. So as journals and institutions are pushing our data scientists to share code, we also need to be sure that we're doing it in a legal manner. The FDA right now is doing a lot of work trying to think about how to regulate machine learning, right? Right now, we don't have any cleared or approved device algorithms that are unlocked or partially unlocked. That is, they learn, they are trained, they are tested, and then they're locked down and implemented as a device. So the next big frontier, of course, is how do you regulate something that's not fully locked down? And there are some contexts in which there would be good reasons to not fully lock down your algorithm. But having a device that might change at any time and in ways that are not fully predictable is something that traditional regulatory approaches are not particularly adept at dealing with. So this is something that there's a lot of conversation going on about right now. And, it would be really good if that conversation were informed by more scholarship and a broader range of inputs than is currently informing that conversation. So I just see that I am just at the end of my time, so I will stop there. I had a lot more to say, but hopefully it will come out in the discussion.